Primary task of all intelligence services, whether it's foreign or domestic, is to provide their governments with credible information about possible threats to the state and its population. According to the CIA's own mission statement, they have four mission points. One is collecting foreign intelligence that matters. Two, producing objective all-source analysis. Three, conducting effective covert action as directed by the president. And four, safeguarding the secrets to help keep our nation safe. But is that what happened regarding the events of September 11, 2001? I would say it's an abject failure. But I would say that didn't start on 9/11 or before 9/11. I think this started well before Bin Laden was even in the radar of the FBI. And not to lose you, the viewer, into a history course. So in this video, I just want to give a short rundown about how the intelligence services got involved with Bin Laden. Now, I'm only going to read from documentary source material. As usual, I will use very minimal speculation. I'd like to go by the historical record. And what we do know is that from what we know through the documentary record is that Bin Laden was on the radar of the CIA and the intelligence services in the very early 1980s. He was a financier coming from a very wealthy family who owned the largest construction magnate in Middle East called the Saudi Bin Laden Group. The 52nd son of Mohammed Awad bin Laden, who basically was the primary construction firm in charge of reconstructing Mecca and Medina and other influential and powerful buildings in the Middle East. Bin Laden, after the war was over, and he spent millions of dollars of his own inheritance from this company to go to the Mujahideen, the Arab Mujahideen fighters and the Afghan Mujahideen in their fight against the Soviets in the 1980s. And they were very much interested through who Bin Laden was. Where did this man come from? And not to forget to mention that the Saudi Bin Laden group was known to the Bush family. A Texas billionaire named James R. Bath had introduced George W. Bush, who was a very young man, and his oil company, Arbusto, I think Arbusto or Arbusto, needed help financing, and the Bin Laden family, not Osama Bin Laden, but the Bin Laden family, put in a couple of $1 million to help kickstart this company in Texas. And so from there, the relationship grew. And Bin Laden, Osama Bin Laden, was basically like a black sheep of the family. Once he started getting involved more with the jihad cause with these Mujahideen groups and the creation of this Arab fundamentalist group in Afghanistan, Bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia in the summer of 1991. He went before the Saudi Council, the intelligence prime minister, Turki bin Faisal at the time, and offered his Arab Mujahideen to fight against or defend the country of Saudi Arabia against an invading Iraqi military, which they weren't going to invade Saudi Arabia based on a lie. However, the Saudi government were fearful of Bin Laden and these Arab Mujahideen. A lot of these Mujahideen fighters came from a CIA program called Operation Cyclone, in which Operation Cyclone funded to the tunes of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars through the Pakistan ISI, who trained and properly armed these Arab Mujahideen fighters, who then went back to their home countries and extended the jihad there. Bin Laden's own group, which would later be called Al-Qaeda, was from an Al-Qaeda base in Afghanistan called al-Masada. Al-Masada had Egyptians, Saudis, Yemenis, Pakistanis who were trained by the ISI through the influence of the CIA. Bin Laden never received money directly from the CIA. If it was indirect through the Maktab al-Khidmat, which is the Afghan Services Bureau created by Abdullah Yusuf Azam, Abdullah Anas, and Bin Laden's wealth. Excuse me. After Azam was assassinated, Bin Laden and the Egyptians under Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri took over the MAC offices. And they were a couple, not just in Pakistan, but also in the United States at this point. The Saudis kept Bin Laden under house arrest. And so with the Saudi intelligence officer, Prince Turki al-Faisal, the head of the General Intelligence Directorate at the time, according to Gerald Posner, he claims that a classified U.S. intelligence report described a secret deal between Turki al-Faisal and Bin Laden, in which Bin Laden would be handed over his funds, unfreeze his passport, but he had to leave the country, and Bin Laden agreed. At that time, Bin Laden was invited to the Sudan under President Omar al-Bashir and the leader of the National Islamic Front, Hassan al-Turabi. Sudan just coincidentally happened to be the only Islamic country in the world that didn't need visitors to come in with a passport. I meant anybody could come in this country. And boy, did they come in. Bin Laden sent emissaries there. Abu Ubaid al-Banshiri, who at that time was one of the military commanders in Egypt and became a military leading commander of al-Qaeda until his death in the early 90s. And then another Egyptian named Abu Hafs al-Masri, also known as Mohammed Atef, took over. Sudan was an ideal place. And with this invitation by Omar al-Bashir, he wanted Bin Laden, he knew that Bin Laden had a lot of wealth. Sudan is a very poor country. But that didn't stop the intelligence services monitoring. Now, according to an Associated Press article dated June 4, 2005, the CIA began monitoring Bin Laden in Khartoum as he had moved in the summer of 1991. Now, why? Bin Laden at this point had just begun his group, al-Qaeda, which was not an international threat. They didn't have any apolitical agendas. They didn't have a preconceived enemy at this point. I'm just going by texts that were written by al-Qaeda in Afghanistan by Ann Sterenson or Mustafa Hamid, Arabs at War, the two best books on al-Qaeda in the world. Al-Qaeda at this point in the very early 90s did not have a preconceived enemy. It wasn't until al-Qaeda left the Sudan to Afghanistan where Bin Laden created his first fatwa. But that's 5 years afterwards. So why was the CIA monitoring Bin Laden in the Sudan? Well, according to an independent contractor who worked for the CIA, Billy Waugh, he, on orders of the CIA, moved to Khartoum and is given the task of spying on him. Now, there's a history behind Billy Waugh. Billy Waugh is a legendary field officer for the CIA. He was involved with the capture of a notorious world terrorist called Carlos the Jackal. And helping him capture him was, of course, somebody that we'll know down the line, Cofer Black, who at that time was a field officer in Khartoum, who later, in 1999, becomes the director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Now, according to this Associated Press article, they reported that Billy Waugh played a typecast role as an aging American fitness enthusiast and would regularly jog past Bin Laden's house, which was a big mansion. It was actually pink and green and very elaborate. They had people with guns on top of the roof in the streets. It was well surrounded. And according to Billy Waugh, he said that he often came face to face with Bin Laden, who Bin Laden at the same time knew that the CIA was tailing him. That's coming from the CIA. This is 1991 now. Now, neither of them said anything, but Billy Wall recalled exchanging pleasantries with bin Laden's Afghan guards. And according to the article, Wall would later recall that I was on a tracking team in Sudan, keeping track of bin Laden in the early days as a possible terrorist network leader. That's funny. A possible terrorist network leader. This is 1991. Al Qaeda wasn't involved in anything at this point. They didn't declare war on the United States. They didn't bomb anything at this point. There was no manual at this point. In fact, through the Harmony documents that we do know of, which are coming from bin Laden's own personal bookshelf, which was documents that was captured after his death in Jalalabad, it actually states that the Al-Qaeda group basically were accepting recruits into Sudan from Afghanistan, but there weren't even many at this point. For the Egyptians and the Takfiris that went along with him. Now, according to Billy Wall, again, the Khartoum chief of station at the CIA told him that bin Laden was one of our targets, that he was a wealthy Saudi financier and possible supporter of a terrorist outfit called Al-Qaeda. Again, why would Al-Qaeda be a terrorist outfit? What did the CIA have at this point in regarding intelligence? We don't know, because it's not classified. Now, according to the article, again, he ran companies there and even owned an entire street in the Al Riyadh district of the city at the time of our surveillance operations against him in 1991 and 92. Bin Laden was not a particularly high priority, though evidence was gathering about him. Well, if evidence was gathering about bin Laden in 91, that means that intelligence began before 91. That means they knew about him before this. Now, I'm not making this up. This is the historical record. At the time, according to Billy Wall, it would have been very easy to take him out. And he also claimed that he saw bin Laden in the mountains of the Pakistan-Afghan border in the late 1980s when we were training the Arab Mujahideen resistance to the Pakistan ISI. Well, that would be Operation Cyclone. And of course, how would Billy Wall know about that? Right? Now, if we go to the Journal of Counterterrorism and Homeland Security International, dated June of 2005, you'll notice that there was more to talk about bin Laden in that period between the late 1980s, early 90s. Now, let's continue, because if the CIA was tracking bin Laden, who else was tracking bin Laden? Of course, the Saudis were, because as I read to you before, Saudi intelligence, through articles from Gerald Posner's book, which is damn good in its own right. Gerald Posner, who basically worked for the Center of Cooperative Research, basically wrote a number of articles about bin Laden. One book in particular, Why America Slept, the Failure to Prevent 9/11, which was a very good book. Basically talked about how Saudi intelligence knew about bin Laden in the mid-1980s. Did they tell the CIA about bin Laden during that time? Or did they know about bin Laden because of his activities with the Maktab al-Khidmat in the 1980s and his activities in Afghanistan against the Soviets in the 1980s? I think it's a combination of both, but we don't know. I mean, we're going by the little information that we have. Now, in the early 90s, between 91 to 93, because it's not been specifically revealed when U.S. intelligence began monitoring bin Laden's phone calls, because he was using satellite phones. Even though the CIA, like I said, had been monitoring him in the Sudan at the end of 91. But according to John Miller's book, The Cell, and also from Lawrence Wright's book, The Looming Tower, in late 1995, the FBI was given 40 thick files on bin Laden from the CIA and the NSA, which were mostly communication intercepts, signals intelligence. Because bin Laden was using a satellite phone while in Khartoum. Remember, he leaves in Khartoum in 96. So he was using satellite phones in Khartoum. 40 thick files, mainly signals intelligence. We're not talking about emails here. We're talking about phone calls, intercepts. What in God's name were they talking about on those phones? Were they talking about operations? Was the 93 bombing mentioned somehow in some passing? Was the bombing of the Yemen hotel talked about? What about embassies in Africa that were being surveilled for future bombing? The sheer amount of material suggests that the surveillance had been going on for years. This is the reason why I started as early as I could through the documentary record to show you that intelligence by these services had been collected well before 9/11, well before bin Laden even created Al-Qaeda. So that means even before Al-Qaeda was created, even before bin Laden declared war on the United States in 96, we're talking about half a decade prior, even earlier than that, a decade prior to his first fatwa in 96, that the intelligence services had information and amass amounts of it on bin Laden. And by default, Al-Qaeda. Now, one person in particular who's an expert on bin Laden and Al-Qaeda is Dan Coleman, who's an FBI agent working out of the bin Laden unit in New York, and began examining those files that he received from the CIA and the NSA, and found that many of them are transcripts from wiretap phones to bin Laden's businesses in Khartoum, Sudan, from 1991 to 1996 when he leaves. 5 years. 5 years. That's a hell of a lot of phone calls. Wouldn't you say? Now, coming from Director Tenet, the CIA director, and this is coming from George Tenet's own book, which I'm currently uploading to my WordPress so that people can read it for themselves at the center of the storm. He says, quote, the then obscure name Osama Bin Laden kept cropping up in the intelligence traffic. The agency spotted Bin Laden's tracks in the early 90s in connection with funding other terrorist movements. They didn't know exactly what the Saudi exile living in Sudan was up to, but they knew it was no good, end quote. Well, how would they know that? Unless they had prior intelligence, phone calls, monitoring it, and now we know there were two agencies already, NSA, CIA. Now, why isn't anybody talking about this? Why isn't anybody talking about how we can file a Freedom of Information request regarding the declassification of what was said on those phones? Now, according to the London Times in an article dated October 7th, 2001, they reported that in the Sudan, between 91 to 96, bin Laden used an $80,000 satellite phone, and Al-Qaeda members used radios to avoid being bugged. But they also used his phone, ranging from Dr. Ayman al-Swahiri, Abu Ubaid al-Banshiri, Mahmoud Salim, Wadi al-Hajj, Ali Muhammad, and others. Now, bin Laden had foolishly was mistaken that in his belief that satellite phones couldn't be monitored. but he was given a satellite phone in 1996 by a person named Khalid Al-Fawaz in the United States, where he bought the satellite phone, who was already being monitored for his links with terrorist groups. And the FBI told the NSA about this satellite phone in 96, in which they monitored that phone. And they found out that this Yemen number kept popping up, which was an Al-Qaeda communications hub in Yemen. But now we're talking about even before that the NSA and the CIA began monitoring Bin Laden, Wadi al-Hajj, Ali Muhammad, Dr. Ahmed al-Zawahiri, Mahmoud Salim. These were all the founders, the primary founders of Al-Qaeda from the al-Masadi training camp in Afghanistan in the mid-1980s. Now, according to an intelligence report in July of 93, the CIA noted that Osama bin Laden had been paying trained members of the Egyptian militant group, the Gamma Islamiyah in the Sudan, and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who were living with him. In August of that year of 93, the State Department claimed that they saw links between bin Laden and the blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, because Rahman was a co-leader of the Gamma Islamiyah and was recently, well, he was actually arrested by the United States for his role in the landmark bombing plot. And to the State Department's own website at the time, they even publicly commented that bin Laden in early 90s in the Sudan was committed to financing jihadis and anti-Islamic and anti-American Islamic regimes worldwide. Finally, in 96, the United States puts economic sanctions on the country of the Sudan, pressuring Omar al-Bashir to forcibly expel bin Laden. The CIA had plans in the early 90s to capture bin Laden. And according to Billy Waugh, he had a scenario where he could actually kill him. But those were rejected by the Clinton administration. So if we had intelligence about bin Laden that goes back to the mid-1980s, that the NSA had been listening to the phone calls of bin Laden's satellite phones from 91 to 96, and then again from 96 to 2001, to 1998, because he stopped using the satellite phone in 98. But by that time, in 96, the NSA was also listening to the Al-Qaeda communications hub in Yemen. What do you think the CIA and the NSA collected? What do you think the Saudis collected? Never mind the Israelis at this point, because we have no evidence the Israelis were involved with bin Laden in the Sudan that we have right now. We do know about the Israeli monitoring system in the year 2000, 2001 in the United States. That's through the Gerald Shea memo. Go look at my playlist about the Gerald Shea memo. Nevertheless, we know there are 3 intelligence services that were involved with bin Laden from the 1980s to the mid-1990s. This is before his first fat run. Saudi General Intelligence Directorate, the NSA, and the CIA. FBI was playing catch-up at this point. So what did they collect? What information did they have that they didn't share? Remember what I said about the primary goal of intelligence. The primary task of all intelligence services is to provide governments with credible information about possible threats to its population and the state. According to the CIA, bin Laden is a credible threat in 91. If that's the case, why didn't they share the information with the State Department? And why didn't they share this information with the public? And until we start asking the right questions, and until we stop with these outlandish theories attributed to 9/11 or the 93 World Trade Center bombing, we will never ask the right questions. And I think these are the right questions to ask. Wouldn't you say? Because at least with the information I provided in this video, we can actually hold people accountable for not sharing this information, which allowed for a man like Bin Laden and his group Al Qaeda to carry out attacks unfettered. But until then, you're going to be chasing a tail that doesn't exist. All right, guys. Thanks for watching the video. See you in the next one.